Dear students, hello and welcome to our interview for Lecture 8 of this programme. We have with us now Claus Leggewie to answer a few questions on the brilliant presentations that he gave. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first question I'd like to ask is about the change in attitude that's going on, and I think you said that it's happening very gradually, and of course we've got a very tight time limit for this transformation, and whether you think that this attitude can change fast enough in time for this.
Well, this is the most important question. Are we fast enough with our changing values, attitudes, etc.? I think the timetable is very much restricted by the importance of climate change. We cannot wait another 20 or 25 years to get into action. This is, if you like, what has changed during the last 20, 25 years. The insight that what politicians call dilatory action. So let's form a commission, let's get some time for decision making, etc. This is no longer possible. So we have to act rather immediately, because otherwise we would have to downgrade CO2 emissions per capita in a way that is kind of undoable. So we need to start right now, and I think the process has already started. And that's why we, in this particular lecture, would like to bring together subjective perceptions, attitudes, opinions about sustainability with this, if you like, objective command, we have to act. Most people are kind of shocked if they would have to act immediately, because there's a certain inertia in all of us. We know this, and we cannot really expect people to speed up in a moment. But what we do is by saying there is already a transformation going on, technologically, politically, legally, but also in our subjective lifestyle perception. That's quite good for bringing people together. And the problem is not so much kind of commanding value change in society, but bring people together who have already started with bringing things together. This is exactly our approach. It's in a way a very participative, democratic, egalitarian approach. In a way it's human to understand the inertia, but also human to kind of trigger motivations, innovations, creativity of the society, and so this is in a way the approach we are following. But you're right, we shouldn't think about starting action in, let's say, 30 years or so. Then it's too late. We wouldn't talk about climate mitigation. We would talk about climate adaptation, which is a completely different thing. Then the effect is done, and we would have to protect ourselves against unwanted consequences. Now we still can act, we can still do something, not just for ourselves, but also for kids and grandkids.
Yeah, great, and it sounds like we've already got a good idea of how to speed this up a bit. Okay, you also mentioned post-materialist ideals, which is interesting. It's not a phrase that I've heard very often, because industrialization to me seems quite a new thing, and now we've gone past that stage even to post-materialism. So would you say this is quite a modern?
I think post-materialist values include some very traditional elements coming from a pre-industrial period, when work, and particularly industrial work and work discipline and the way of living industrial societies have kind of developed, were not at all accepted. The ideals of work and life in, let's say, medieval times were completely different from ours. But it combines also the effects of industrialization in terms of gaining leisure time, gaining creativity, gaining time for families, friends, etc. So it combines pre-industrial and post-industrial imaginations and efforts. And I think it's quite interesting to have this development, not just in core industrial countries, but also in countries who just started their industrial development. So if you look at lifestyle in Burkina Faso and other places south of Sahara, Africa, you would find interesting models for, you know, lifestyles in our societies too. On the other hand, you have the effects of education, of modernization, let's say at the Chinese East Coast or in places like Mumbai, where post-industrial developments already started, and people have kind of second thoughts, not just gaining material values and material wealth, but also gaining more time, for example, for family, friends. If you ask people all around the world, what is your first priority? Most people would say, my friends, my family, my kids, my particular kind of hobby, whatever. This is what most people interest, and industrial discipline in terms of we have to work more, we have to gain more money, we have to buy the next car is a kind of secondary impulse. It comes from consumerism and mass consumerism after, let's say, the 50s, 60s. It's very much a certain phase, if you like, a footnote in human development, and I think we can get over it.
Yeah, yeah. So why do you think that in these developing countries that they've kind of skipped this phase of materialism?
Well, this is not the first, and it should be quite. If you would live, for example, in a suburb of Mumbai or of Shanghai, you would, of course, in a way, naturally or normally aspire all the values and material symbols of Western culture. In terms, you would like to have a fat car, you would like to have a huge apartment for yourself, you would like to have consumer goods, etc. This is in a way quite normal, and it's not our intention to discredit all these intentions, hopes and value systems at all. I think what we suggest, very simple, is that many emerging and so-called underdeveloped countries can simply leapfrog a certain phase of industrial development. It's not necessary to enter the phase of carbon development. We started it in Germany, for example, or in the UK, in Australia, between, let's say, the 30s and 1900. It's not necessary for countries like India or China or Burkina Faso or Mexico to enter this phase and to go through it all the way. If you have the chance to simply leapfrog this stage of development and to get into an industrial development based on, and human development based on regenerative energies, alternative paths to the future, just develop new kinds of mobility, new kinds of land use. They don't have to go through all this, and this is exactly the advantage of so-called underdeveloped countries. They can simply spare out this particular phase of industrialization and can go to a different mode of development.
Yeah, which is great for the transformation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask, I kind of noticed perhaps a slight catch-22 or a vicious cycle in that individuals who want to make change happen and want to change their lifestyles, they reach barriers with the status quo and the government who doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it obvious what you can do about it. And then on the other hand, if the government want to make changes to make this easier for people, then some people aren't prepared to change their lifestyles as well. So it seems like, you know, there's barriers from both sides.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And this is indeed a kind of vicious circle we have to get over. I mean, if you look at your personal ambitions, many of us would be able and capable to change lifestyle, and even some have not just this loss aversion that I was talking about, but are in a way kind of engineers of a new and better life for themselves. And on the other hand, you have interesting ideas on the political and administrative level. And what we found is a rather high developed intelligence about all these sustainability issues in administration, not just in Germany, in all over Europe, in India, in China, wherever you go. So there is a lot of evidence for we should act, and the important thing is to bring in a kind of triangle technological developments, for example, regenerative energies. I have described an example for that from bottom up in Germany with political legal action. So, if you like, intelligent legislation, intelligent political motivation nudges from the administration itself with the wishes and intentions of a broad segment of the population, not just younger generations, through all the generations, and to bring this together to form a kind of triangle. And this creates a kind of self-efficacy moment in society. You're not alone. This is exactly what I would like to say. Many of us would like, then this finger pointing starts. I will start if you start, or we will act whenever the state or the political machine is starting. And politicians would say, yeah, we would be able to act, but we have no legitimation from below. Or corporations would say, well, we have all the technologies, we have even the investments, but we have no, the action is not supported by political. And so this is permanent finger pointing, and I think we have to stop that. Everybody can simply act at his particular level, on her particular level, and say, okay, I cannot wait until 1 billion Chinese are ready for transformation. I will start in my own environment, and I can do this, and maybe I can even be happy with that.
Yeah, so someone just needs to take the initiative and then the ball will be rolling. Yeah,
and this is, if you like, the core idea of a democratic society, to make a difference, to make a new beginning. This is a very Arendtian, Hannah Arendt idea for what politics is about. It's not waiting for political action from above. It's forming initiatives, and many of us would say, well, this kind of transformation that the Global Change Council, the Advisory Council is proposing is completely impossible. It cannot be done in this short period of time and on a global scale. But if you look at a historical process in the recent past, like, for example, the Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe, nobody would have thought, even in 1985 when Gorbachev started, that this would have such profound effects for global society. And I think for the better, not just catastrophic events come very quickly. So I would say, if looking at these kind of historical transformations, revolutions in a way, we should not give up the idea that we can do it.
Yeah, that's great, thanks. So I just wanted to come back to post-materialism and ask you whether you think it's come far enough, because it kind of occurred to me when you were talking about people not being prepared to pay upfront costs for more energy efficient fridges, for example, even though in the long run this would save them money. It seemed to me quite a materialistic viewpoint to have.
Sure, this is the general impression. You go to a store, you buy a fridge, and you would say, well, this is the cheapest or the most effective or the biggest or whatever. This is normal. This is how we decide our consumer options. We would say it has to be very cheap. It must look good. It has a certain kind of reputation. Fridges, cars, houses, whatever. Then this next idea comes to your mind. If fossil energy is so expensive, shouldn't I take a more efficient fridge or car or house? So for the long run, let's say the next 25 years, maybe this investment, this higher investment, will simply be okay. So this is the next idea that comes to you. Would you think about the next generation of about your kids or grandkids if you buy a fridge or a car? This is exactly what it is about. If you simply have these materialistic options, you would, and that must be okay. And state subsidies and ratings, etc., can help us, can stimulate, if you like, better behavior of the consumer. But in the long run, ideas of a good life, not just for yourself, but also for future generations, this is what counts. And so in a way, make a family conference about buying a fridge, buying a car, and let simply kids talk, co-decide, and bring your own ideas. It's not just about reputation, not just the price. This is the general information of the consumer to a producer or to an investor. But now we have different symbols and signs from the consumer to producers. And corporate social responsibility would include to offer more interesting consumer options. Political action would include to offer more intelligent options for the consumer, etc. So maybe these things come together. Price and reputation not the only signal, there are other signals too.
Yeah, could lead to a whole new way of consumerism even.
Yeah, and I think consumerism is really a kind of sleeping giant in the political arena. Most social scientists wouldn't agree with me when I say this is really a political force. But if you look at your own behavior in the supermarket or buying a car, a fridge, etc., then it's obvious how much political potential your individual decision might have combined with others. If you wouldn't say, well, I could buy a new fridge, I could buy a better, I could use a different model of intelligent mobility for myself, but the others won't do. This is exactly the problem. If you would be more aware of the fact that others have already done this or would follow you because you're a role model in your neighborhood, then it's much easier to be a front runner.
Yeah. Okay, I should take that into account when I buy my next fridge then.
Maybe.
Yeah.
No, we have these ratings, A+, etc., which is an interesting information. If you look at, you go to a car shop and you have a couple of cars there. Many people have now inside, in the UK it's much more developed than in Germany, you have, okay, there's an A+, and this is also an interesting information. If you look at advertisement for cars, you have already the information about CO2 emission. This is quite new, and if ever this becomes a signal, a symbol, and a really relevant information for the consumer, then we are on the right way.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. Moving on to episode 2 now, you were talking about these change agents, the effects that they've had in different industries, and you mentioned land use, forestation and the mobility sector, and I was wondering if you had any examples from these sectors.
From mobility, for example,
yes.
We were already talking about this, about changing from individual mobility with your personal car, price, opportunities, reputation, all that is interesting. In Germany, driving a car is still a symbol of freedom, individual freedom. But nevertheless, public transport is an option, car sharing is an option, and the interesting thing about that is that corporations, including these giant German automobile corporations, are already developing models for car-to-go, car sharing, connecting, for example, public transportation on rail with individual mobility in cities based on a car, electric car, whatever. So car producers are no longer car producers, that's it. They are now, let's say, agencies for intelligent mobility. This is the way it has to go, but still there are other intentions. There is reputation, there is export. If you can export premium cars to China or India, and you're okay with that, you wouldn't be motivated to invent a much more efficient mobility pattern. That's true. But it's interesting that car producers, car corporations, automobile corporations are starting to think in these terms, not just offering a thing, a consumer good like a car, but offering an access to mobility, opening a network of different ideas how individual, collective mobility patterns can come together. And if you look at most metropolitan areas, the hours you spend in a car, in a traffic jam, would make it much more convenient for you to choose public transportation whenever the public sector is offering it. So the whole thing in our report is also about common goods. The realization that common goods are not just cannot just be offered by individual action, but have to be offered by institutional actors, corporations, the state, etc. This is, I think, the right way.
Yes, and I think public transportation needs to be made more attractive for people as well. It's very important.
And attractive means price-wise, means the opportunities must be there. For example, the area where I'm living in, you have, after, let's say, 10 p.m., you don't have the opportunity to take public transportation at all from one city to the next one. This has to be changed, but it's also about reputation. It's also about reputation. A place like Berlin, many people do not have cars because you don't need it, but also because it's not smart. It's not really the thing. Even younger generations, there is a certain shift now. It's much more interesting for them to have a mobile phone, you know, a certain kind of mobile phone. I won't mention the company right now, but to have a car in the traditional sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. You're mentioning change agents for the transformation in particular. I noticed that there's really quite a few different change agents, and none of them stand out so much. Like, we don't have a Willy Brandt for the transformation, for example. Do you think there's any more prominent role models, or do you think it's better to have just a lot?
I think we need both. I think we need some people who serve as role models, and it's interesting to have these reports on what kind of cars government members use and how much CO2 the emission is at stake in these particular. I think the Chancellor of Federal Republic needs to have a certain kind of car that makes a role model. On the other hand, it's quite interesting to have these role models institutionalized in advertisement, etc. So creating a new sphere of cultural symbolism in that regard. But then, of course, much more important is really a broad acceptance of all this and action from below. I think this is the most important thing. Otherwise, it's just a mimicry for, you know, or greenwashing or whatever. No, I think that really the interesting point is in how far value changes affect consumption patterns of the whole society and how this comes from below. And then this triangle I was talking about needs to be established: technological innovation, public action from state and quasi-governmental organizations and general public.
Yes, of course there's always I think a lot of fear that some people have is that it could all lead to a kind of eco-dictatorship.
Yeah. I think some people reacted to our report in that sense and were saying, how do they know, scientists they are, what is good for society? We were not saying, there's no dictatorship aspect in the whole report, not at all. The contrary is true. We are in favor of a democratic solution. If ever the democratic public decides not to go into action, not to support sustainable lifestyles, this is the risk of a democracy, and we wouldn't say then democracy is out of the business. This is exactly the sovereign who decides in what direction we go. And I think political leaders would have to make the alternatives clear. What kind of, there is, for example, in many governments in Europe, a kind of fight going on between very conservative segments saying, well, economic growth, that's what it's all about, particularly in a financial crisis. We have to go back to this first, and then we might think about sustainable development, whereas other segments, and I think growing segments in the political elites, would argue the other way around. They would say, no, let's think about a sustainable development and make it interesting for a green economy, for a green modernization, and even for crisis solution in our current situation.
Yes, and yes, so thank you very, very much for all these insights that you've given us. I think they've added a lot to the presentation as well, and I hope that our students think the same. So thank you very much for that, Claus.
Thank you.